Today I'm going to talk about the great NA problem. This is a recurring problem in esports, generally about the lack of international success for NA teams in esports, and it's generally related to the infrastructure of these teams or the mindset and the culture of NA. So, for instance, in CS:GO, they've been pretty successful relative to other NA counterparts. C9 last year won ESL Pro League. Team Liquid got to the finals of the major and like a semifinals of another major. But I guess there's like a caveat to that one because Simple is like a nuclear weapon. So he was like one of the most talented players to ever touch that game, and he happened to peak at both of those tournaments. Yeah, the other players were very good, but it felt pretty obvious to me that at least Simple was the superstar of those tournaments. Optic was pretty good at the end of last year. They won like E League in a surprising like upset, and then they won. Not won. They got second in ECS the following week, and then they failed at like the group stage. But even then, that one has like caveats to it. Like they played Virtus Pro first round because of bad seeding. Then Astralis got upset in the first round, and then the randomizer matched the two of them up. So they played again, and they lost 2-0. Leaving them down 0-2 to like the eventual like finalists of the major. But I mean, if they had been really good enough, they probably could have made it. But that's like a bad luck draw because there's like a bunch of other like internal issues that were going on apparently with that team because Stanislav left right afterwards, right? So, and then LOL famously like MSI. TSM dropped out of group stages. Last Worlds they dropped out of group stages. But a bunch of like the NA League of Legends scene, they always like, I wouldn't say disappoint. I say like they play about par, which is they don't do very well. So I'm not sure if that's technically a disappointment or not. I guess it really depends on what you expect from that region. I don't really expect much, but apparently a lot of people do. So in that sense, they are a disappointment. And so the question is generally, what is the reason for all of this? Because NA as a scene in both games has like a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of infrastructure, and yet they failed to like crack a dent competitively internationally. And yeah, they might be rich, but like the whole point is to try to win. At least I feel that's the whole point, is to try to win. And they're generally like the regions considered weaker than the other regions. So here are some excuses for the general reasons I've heard of. In the past for CS:GO, there are things like salaries, lack of teams, lack of tournaments, but those are gone now, so you can ignore those. And that there's like practice partners aren't as good as Europe, and I feel like that one's gone and like been already disproven by like Luminosity, now SK, Immortals, and then like the current Luminosity. Like there's basically like three Brazilian teams that have like risen up in that time that have been, yeah, the third one isn't good, but it isn't nearly as good. Like they're basically like a tier 3-ish team, but like the other two have proven basically that you can like raise up without having a lot of good practice partners, and critically like NA themselves can practice at those teams right now, so that's kind of out the window. And then there's like a lack of in-game leaders, but they don't really use the in-game leaders they have, so I'm not really sure that is a lack so much as they just don't respect the ones they have, like Daps, Adren, FNS, Semphis. Like, basically, they're not as skilled, obviously, as like the top tier of players, but you have to compensate for that because they have something that you need. So, but because none of the teams, none of the players in that region really want them, what happens is you get like ad hoc leaders, and it worked once with Stanislaw. It worked okay with Stewie. Most of the times, it completely did not work for Team Liquid. To be fair, in Team Liquid's case, they only did it because Peacemaker was banned by Valve, basically, or not banned, but like he was restricted from in-game leading. So they basically took him out of the game, and like they had built the entire system on the pivotal aspect of that he could call in the game, so that's kind of a different issue, right? So in-game leaders isn't really a problem. I feel like, but it is like a it does point to the actual problem, which is like the mindset or the culture that is like NA in esports for whatever reason. And the general culture is this happens in like League of Legends where people apparently don't League of Legends. People say like the solo queue here is worse, and there's like the talent pool isn't like really growing as a fast rate compared to like other regions because the solo queue players don't really take it seriously. And then it's kind of similar-ish in CS:GO, where when CS:GO is more like they take they don't really play like proper CS. They don't really like focus as much as on the competitive side. Like apparently, like there's been a lot of complaints about basically like pros like spending too much time focusing on focusing on the stream. I don't mean like they do it in their off hours. I mean like what happens is they feel like that's their priority over being a competitive player. So, and then they play like too much FPLs and rather than do things like DMing or like going things over as a team. Basically, not learning the proper way, I guess, or the macro way of playing these games. And like finally, I guess I'll throw in Dota 2 in here, but Dota 2 is kind of a weird like example because of the way that game works. Basically, leadership is put at a premium because leadership is generally whether or not it's like said out loud. Basically, leadership is the highest like value you can get. Yeah, there's superstar players on the team on teams, and superstar players are what you have to have if you want to be a championship, if you want to have a champion. But in general, in Dota 2, the success of teams follows the in-game leader rather than the superstar players. So like Shocks, it doesn't really matter who his leader is, whether he's leader or somebody else is leader. Success follows that guy around. It doesn't follow around Happy or Existence. It follows him, right? And and then there's like Olaf Meister, and then there's basically like a bunch of generally speaking, like success will follow like the super sealed players in CS:GO, and the same thing can be said for League of Legends, like Fakers. Fakers right up there, and then like basically all like the most successful teams in CS:GO, in League of Legends I've seen have all been based around like superstar level types of talents. So that's not the case in Dota 2, because in Dota 2 what's happening is, here's like a funny statistic I looked up at some point, or if you want to look at like TIs over the years, the most successful players at TIs, like 3 of them are in-game leaders: Xiao 8, Puppy, PPD. The only one that isn't an in-game leader is Hao, and that's because he was like a superstar player. And he's only the superstar player, but he's like for whatever reason, Hao is like the one, I guess. Like he's the only one skilled enough to not have to follow in-game leader around, rather success follows him around. So that's kind of why Dota 2 is a weird example for this. But in Dota 2, I feel like the NA scene hasn't really risen. But the difference between in Dota 2 and CS:GO League of Legends is I don't think Dota 2 really has like a mindset problem when it comes to like taking the game seriously. Like they have a bunch of like in-house leagues. They all take the ladder seriously. It's more like currently I think they don't have really good in-game leaders beyond PPD, who's retired, Crit, who's import, and Eternal Envy. And then I guess if you want to count DC as NA, I don't know why you would, but Misery is a good in-game leader, but it's not like he's trying to create an NA stack here. He's got all Europeans, right? So that's a bit different. And I feel like basically the mindset is so for instance, if they don't take it seriously, that's one problem. Another problem might be they might take it very seriously, but they like have super huge egos. So what happens is like you get a bunch of these guys with egos and they clash. They clash often because the way to find success in any of these esports team games is to like grind by yourself on the ladder. So basically what's happening is you're like 1v like the best way to like go up is generally to like 1v5, or basically take the game and carry it. So by the time you get to a place where like you've proven you're good enough to play at the top level, what happens is like you've already built like this mindset, like it has to go my way, I have to do it this way in order to win. and it becomes like a very hard thing to like break out of, especially because when they reach that age, they're generally like late teens, like 17, 18, 19. So when you're that young, it's very like you don't really have the processes in your mind or to understand that there are like other ways to do things. There are other ways to do things, or like other people could be right. So it's very hard for those types of players to like listen to a coach, or what might happen is they might just clash with somebody else who like they might just clash with somebody else on the team, and then that creates more problems that cascades into like a bunch of internal issues. So I feel like you kind of see this problem in Overwatch, I guess. So for instance, there have been two Korean imports in Effect, who is a DPS player, and then in Kaiser, who's a tank player. Now, I think in theory, most of the analysts think, or most of the people I've followed, basically think the DPS in the West is about equivalent, or maybe or close to, or around like the Korean level DPS. So the question is, then why would you get a Korean DPS player? And the reason you would get a Korean DPS player is because they have like the mindset of a regular Korean player, which is like more easily like team based. Because like if you get like a Western DPS player, they're the ones with like bigger egos, so they're generally the ones that are gonna like create like havoc problems on the team. So that's why somebody would go for Effect. Whereas I think Kaiser is obviously like a better choice, because like the difference between Kaiser as a tank player and like Western tank players is bigger, so you're getting more value out of him as a player. But to be fair, like Effect is really fucking good. So from what I've seen, like, so that's kind of like an iffy-ish example, but it illustrates the point, right? Basically, a bunch of these like these orgs are basically just trying to figure out a way to minimize like this mindset issue, and that's why you create a bunch of these mixed teams, and that's what Dota 2 did. Like, EG right now has Crit and Zai, and they're kind of like the role players ish. Yeah, they're basically like the sport players, but Zai's, and then they take more of a backseat to guys like Sumail and RTZ. During like PPD's reign, basically, it was a similar idea during that time. And then like internal Envy's team, he did try like an NA stack, but it's not that it was bad so much as it's not that it broke up because of internal issues or like mindset issues. It was more like they didn't have like good enough players, so that's why I bring in somebody like Palai Dai and Fada. So those are kind of like weird. Those are kind of like offbeat examples of like offbeat examples don't really work in this case, because what's happening with them is or it works for EG's case because basically it's more of like Zai himself like has more laid back personality, and so does Crit. So those two guys like create much less conflict than like when PPD was captaining. Like they're famously, Eternal Envy called that team the most cancerous team of all time, but they were good enough that the success just like stuck them together for longer periods of time than that team probably should have stuck together, like in terms of like internal conflicts. So that's why that's eventually probably why the entire like RTZ EG to Secret cycle kept happening, was because like PBD kept thinking he could probably get RTZ to follow him, but then it would never work out, and then they break apart, and then the cycle would continue over and over and over again. Whereas in Eternal Envy's case, it's more like he doesn't really have internal, like he did have internal issues before, but it was like during the Cloud9 days. It was because I don't think he ever truly accepted the fact that he was like, he had to be the in-game leader. Like I always felt like he was halfway in, halfway out, but I feel like at this point he must accept the fact that he's in-game leading, so maybe that'll like fix the internal issues for him. But I'm getting off the topic. Basically, like Eternal Envy, he switched that team switched players because that team wasn't like the positions weren't good enough. Like Eternal Envy mid wasn't good enough. Fala mid is a much better player. Palai Dai is one of the best like support players. So like in comparison, there was no reason to keep the other players, especially because that particular team NP already has like built-in synergy, because they've all all of them had played together before during the old Cloud9 days, except for MSS, and MSS played like with like 2 of them during the NP days, so it should be fine. All right. So if you want to solve like the NA problem, I guess, which is basically like the mindset issue or the cultural issue, you might want to look at successful examples in other regions. So in Korea, I think the most successful example was in Brood War, and the way they did it was they had a tournament called Courage. And what Courage did is it forced like a bunch of like these amateurs, like high level amateurs, to play against each other, and then the winner, if he won, would get like a pro license, and then he'd get bid, and then like teams could bid on him and then buy him and then put him on their B team, and then once they're in your B team, you're basically like the maid of like the A team. But in exchange, you basically get to play like Brood War all day, and then you play against like a bunch of the B teamers and the A teamers, and like the A teamers will tell you what to do, but they don't really teach you. Sometimes the coach might teach you, but I feel like that's pretty rare. And then you go up the ladder that way. And this is kind of a funny example of like proving like practice partners don't really matter, because Flash famously is like the best example, the best player to ever touch Brood War, and like his mentors, if you want to call them, were Fire Fist, Pepe, and Hero V. And you can look up those names. Nobody knows about them because they're basically just B teamers who never got anywhere. But those were like the 3 guys that spent like that basically like created the foundations of what Flash eventually became. Apparently, that's according to Flash. Like those 3 were the guys who taught him like a lot of the stuff early on when he first joined KT back in the day. So another very good example of like an infrastructure, like a scene that works in like creating like a bunch of like rising talent all the time is Danish CS:GO. And basically what's happening there is like, yeah, you have like the top tier teams, but below them you have like a very strong mix of teams, and those teams are generally controlled by guys who teach proper CS. So Snappy and Hunden are like 2 examples. Or like Hunden is like, Hunden, if he was an NA, would never be on a team because his skill is not nearly good enough. But he'll always have a team on that level in Denmark because everybody respects him for like the amount of knowledge he has on how to run a team. So he's like an important figure in developing like these Danish talents. Snappy is also, and then MSL was back in the day, where basically what would happen is they like a Danish player would rise up. He'd get spotted, and he'd join this team culture, or maybe it might be a country culture. I'm not sure, but basically like they teach him the proper way, and he'd like be willing to learn this way. Whereas that doesn't happen at all in comparison to NA CS:GO, or like basically I think Moses did this in some video a while back, where basically he said the reason NA CS:GO was like so miserable back then. It's not quite as miserable now. It's less miserable. But it was so miserable back then was because all the guys who had this kind of like knowledge, had this kind of tactical base, who understood proper like CS:GO, like 5v5, was all of them retired when CGS exploded. So there were very few like experienced in-game leaders who could teach like the next generation of players how to play like proper CS. So you just get a bunch of like these superstars and none of them know, or like a bunch of like these star players, or like a bunch of skilled players who don't know how to play a team style, who don't really know like the basics or the fundamentals that are needed to function in like a international level of team. And like you can see this problem is cropping up in a bunch of other different like CS countries. Like Finland is a pretty good example, where like you got a bunch of good players but you have no in-game leaders. So they're basically just waiting around until like one of them decides one day they will take up the leadership role as like a full-time thing. Probably another example that's going to be very, very relevant for this discussion of like creating infrastructure is going to be Brazilian CS:GO. Specifically, it's going to be Games Academy that was created by Fallen, where he basically built this entire like school system for like the CS:GO players, where he teaches like the Brazilian players, or I guess technically anybody who could speak Portuguese could learn this, but he teaches these guys how to play fundamental CS, and that style is basically like permeated within the Brazilian scene. It's kind of like become like the trademark of that scene where you're playing this very tactical, very structured style, and that's kind of been built into the scene. So that's kind of like a possible solution for the NACS problem, or the NALL League of Legends problem. And the way currently people try to solve this problem is by imports. And the reason people think imports kind of solves this problem is like you get, for like an owner, I guess you get like a double-edged benefit. The first benefit is, or I guess a triple edge, I guess. The first benefit is you'll probably get a better player. The second edge is like that player's like attitude. Generally, if it's it doesn't really matter if it's Korean, European, but like basically they'll work harder is general attitude I get from these kinds of guys. So because they work harder, that like affects the entire team morale, where like basically if you see this one guy practicing, you kind of feel like a dick for not practicing, I guess. Or you kind of feel like, oh, this guy's doing so much, I have to at least like match him, or I have to at least like put in more effort, so I feel like I'm not slowing this guy down. So there's kind of like implicit pressure there, that in a good way. And then like the third reason is because if you bring up a bunch of imports, the idea is basically you're raising the solo queue bars. So the idea is like you can only become the best by playing the best, is the general philosophy behind that. Like I said, I don't really buy into it, but it does work. Actually, it does work. Like if you eventually like keep playing better players, eventually you will get better. Like, and like this sentiment has been like talked about before. This happened in StarCraft 2 actually, where like Hearthstone basically said something along the lines of he felt his best play was during like the WCS EU 2013-2014 era, where you had a bunch of Korean imports playing in WCS Europe. And what happened was like they keep playing on the ladder, and because they were better players, like eventually like Hearthstone would learn how they played, and then he himself became a better player during that time. For a counterpoint to that, like apparently a bunch of like his pro player contemporaries don't think he was a better player then than he is now, but I'm not sure if they necessarily disagree with the fact that he did become a better player because of it. So that's kind of a question. That's kind of like an interesting sort of segue. I do think, however, that everybody who played Pult when he went to WCS NA all got better. Now Pult is a funny example because he didn't necessarily play in WCS NA all that much. Like I kept hearing a bunch of rumors that he was basically like living in Korea most of the time or something. But when he did play in NA, like what happened was the macro play went up, because what happened with playing Pult is like his mechanics aren't particularly good. Like they're only average, or I think they're only average. I think like there's a bunch of NA or EU players who are mechanically better than him. But like the problem with playing Pult is that he's tactically and strategically better than almost every player in like the mid game to the late game. So even if he went down early, and this often happened, he would go down. He would always lose big advantages early game. He could find a way back into the game. So basically, what's happening is he's like implicitly teaching you how to play this game, how to play this game positionally, and that's why like when he played on like NA ladder, people could learn from him in that sense. But like I said, these are a bunch of like anecdotes and not backed up by hard data. So whether or not that's working is questionable. I think it is, but it's not a very like good way to it's not a way that solves like the complete infrastructure problem. Like, and the infrastructure problem is generally how do you fix the culture, or how do you fix the mindset of these NA players, right? Because I think that's like the implicit problem here. I think that's the explicit problem, I guess, is for a bunch of these esports games is how do you fix the mindset problem. And Dota 2, I'm not actually sure they have a mindset problem, because they all practice pretty hard. I've never heard any of them ever say like they took scrims unseriously, but they did have that one guy Ritsu like leaking scrims, so I guess they did have a problem. So that's a bit different, but how do you solve this problem is that's the question. And I feel like Fallen showed a possible answer. Is basically you just make a school, and then you basically make a school, and then hopefully, I guess this won't be the case. Hopefully, like the guys in like the top of the end of the ladder like join the school because they want to learn. They want to learn from like the best in the world. But whether or not that works in NA is like, I'm not sure it would work in NA because, like I said, they have like these huge egos. But it's worth a shot. Another answer might be you get a bunch of coaches and you create. All right, here's another potential answer, but it's not very good because of the current way the League of Legends like tournament scene works. Is you create a bunch of tournaments, and then you basically just make them open, and you only allow like a bunch of NA teams to play, and you have to run these tournaments for like years. You're gonna at least have to run it for like 2 years before you get any profit, and eventually what's gonna happen is like these NA teams will keep shuffling over and over and over again, and eventually you'll get a guy who you'll get like a few guys who realize like they can win a bunch by just becoming the captain and like creating a bunch of these teams, and then those guys will be teaching the rest of their players how to play like the game properly, and then hopefully the other teams when they play them will realize, oh, maybe I should play this properly. But that's not really, I'm not really sure how it works in NACS, but I feel like even if it did work that way in NACS, I'd probably have to research it, but I feel like it doesn't really matter as much in NACS because it's not really for the local players or the regional players, I guess, because what happens is even if you did win, for instance, you won that tournament, you'd probably get bought out and then you'd probably get kicked because nobody wants to get relegated, and the owners themselves probably thinking in their minds, I could get better players than this. Like this happened in EU famously for this season, or like in the last few seasons, like of NACS, like High came back with a bunch of like former C9 players, and like this, so it doesn't quite work out, but that's a possible solution. And okay, so if we assume then that you have to get to these guys earlier, then how do you do it? Like, how do you, if you assume that, all right, so if you assume the mindset is the problem, and then infrastructure is the answer, the question is what kind of infrastructure, and those were two examples of the school or the tournaments, or I guess a third possible solution is what Total Biscuit did in StarCraft 2, which is he incentivized the ladder, and how he did that was he incentivized it by running a tournament where what happens is if you go up the ladder, you qualify for the tournament, and like a bunch of the StarCraft 2 NA guys all thought this was really good because what happened during those seasons was they'd get a lot better practice because everybody was taking the game much more seriously than before, and it bring back all the NA players because generally what happens in NA StarCraft 2 is like the East Coast players play in Europe and then the West Coast players play in Korea, so it's kind of like force them all back and like force them all playing again. So I guess you could do it that way as well, where you kind of incentivize the ladder, but it doesn't quite work as well in a team game, like I said, because you're trying to teach them like macro mechanics, and it doesn't necessarily like solve the like mindset issue, which I think a leader does. All right, I should probably point out what exactly a leader is, because basically a leader is like a leader or captain or whatever you want to call it, kind of works as like an entire infrastructure. Basically, because what this guy does is he's creating like the strategy, the team color, or like the team identity, the tactics. He's developing the players. He's scouting players. He is scouting opponents. So, and he's taking like the spiritual leader role. So, when you have all these things in one guy, that's kind of like you're kind of like expecting too much out of this random guy to take it up. So generally you want like coaches to like solve this issue, but are you really going to like pay a bunch of coaches to like make a bunch of like amateur teams that play each other and then hope like one of them like pans out? So that's kind of like a problem if you wanted to go that route. Whereas like the other like my answer was basically like you create an environment where hopefully a bunch of captains show up, but that might not be the case. Like I said, all these problems are basically just throwing money at the problem or burning money. And I feel like there was no incentivized reason for any League of Legends NA team to like buy into the infrastructure of developing the region when they could just import outside of the region, but import outside the region and like just slowly filter in whatever few talents you can get from the NA. So I mean, I probably need a bit more research into that as to whether or not it's a viable solution. But I feel like they're trying to do this basically in CS:GO already. So like the MDL is basically what the whole purpose of that league, and then the Premier, and then but it in NACS like the problem is basically like a bunch of these lower guys apparently like taking streaming more seriously than they're taking like the competitive side. So they're not taking their games as seriously, so they're not learning. And like I said, like there's a general mindset for whatever reason that like leaders are always undervalued in that region. Like, so there's always a few question marks. I'm not really sure how to solve the NA problem in CS:GO as much. All right, so all this comes. The reason I was thinking of all this initially is because I was trying to theorize what Overwatch was trying to do with this contender league. I feel like that's kind of this is their answer to the infrastructure problem, I think, or the infrastructure problem, because the Overwatch Contender League is basically a league that will qualify you into the biggest league for Overwatch, right? And so basically they run this like gigantic tournament where a bunch of teams any team can be made, and then they play in the tournament, and then eventually if they get far in the tournament, it works as both like a scouting grounds for like teams already in the Overwatch League, and it works as like kind of like a testing ground for like teams. So basically incentivizes team play, like it incentivizes team play for for the lower end. And I assume the idea is you would have a bunch of these tier 2 teams. Like I'm guessing they want somebody like Selfless to do this, but I guess the idea is you want Selfless or you want a TSM to like bring up these teams and then have this infrastructure and this coaching staff, and then you would create this team, and then because with the coaching staff they have, they basically like replace the in-game leader role for a bunch of these teams, and eventually when they get to the finals or they win out, they could either like finally get investment from a basketball team or like sell it to a basketball team. But I feel like there's like a problem in there in that it kind of depends on the basketball team knowing what they're doing, and nothing from like Energy or Echo Fox has convinced me they know what they're doing. But that's like a different topic, I guess. So I feel like in theory that's kind of what they're doing, and I think it's better than the training league they have. But so I assume the way they want to do it is they want to run like the regular Overwatch League for like 3 or 4 months, and then playoffs for like another month, and then during that time they have the Contender League, and then the Contender League will be the Farm League, and it will be like the infrastructure for like raising a bunch of these players, and then for the rest of the year they have like a bunch of the Open Circuit, but the Open Circuit is also basically like an extension of the Contender League, assuming like open teams can somehow like qualify online onto the LANs. So that kind of style might be pretty good too. But like I said, I don't really know if that's what they're aiming for with the Overwatch Contender League. It's just how I think, like how I'd work backwards, assuming this is what they want from it. So basically that's the NA problem, and those are like some of the solutions, but they're not the greatest solutions. They're just more like solutions that haven't been tried yet, so you may as well try them. It's a complicated issue, dealing with like entire like mindset, I guess. Well, see you next time.